Emma thought it would be just another lazy afternoon. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across her family's farm as she wandered the familiar trails behind her house. Her dog, Max, a playful mix of energy and curiosity, trotted ahead, nose to the ground, tail wagging in fits of excitement. Emma smiled, her mind wandering to school projects and weekend plans, when suddenly Max froze. His ears perked up, and his body stiffened, as if he had caught a scent that didn't belong. At first Emma thought it was a rabbit, or maybe the neighbor's cat sneaking through the woods again, but Max was insistent, barking and tugging at his leash with a determination she'd never seen before. Curiosity got the better of her. "All right, boy," she murmured, following his lead into the denser part of the forest she rarely explored. The air seemed to change as they moved deeper, cooler, quieter, almost as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Emma's steps slowed as her surroundings became unfamiliar. The well-worn trail gave way to overgrown brush and twisting roots, and soon they came upon something she'd never seen before, a cabin. Hidden behind a curtain of vines and weathered by years of neglect, it looked out of place, like a forgotten memory no one wanted to revisit. Emma hesitated at the edge of the clearing, unsure if she should go any closer. But Max, as if pulled by an invisible force, trotted confidently toward the door. Emma followed, her heart beating faster now, her curiosity battling with an inexplicable sense of unease. What was this place? And why did it feel like they weren't meant to find it? She reached for the rusted doorknob, Max panting eagerly at her side, when the faint sound of something inside stopped her cold. A creak, like the floor shifting under the weight of someone or something. Emma took a breath and stepped forward, not knowing that this moment would mark the beginning of a journey that would change everything she thought she knew about her family, her home, and the world she lived in. Emma was the kind of girl who could find an adventure in anything. At just 12 years old, her boundless energy and natural curiosity made her a constant explorer, even in the familiar landscapes of her family's farm. With her dark curls always tied up in a loose ponytail and a scuffed pair of sneakers that had seen more mud than pavement, she was never one to stay indoors for too long. Her loyal companion, Max, a wiry mutt with a coat as mismatched as his endless energy, was always by her side. Max wasn't just her pet, he was her partner in every escapade. Whether chasing after squirrels or playing endless games of fetch, Max had a way of turning the ordinary into something exciting. Emma often joked that Max seemed to know things before they happened, like when a summer storm was about to hit, or when her mum was baking cookies. The two shared an unspoken connection, one that went beyond the usual girl and dog bond. Emma loved Max's boundless enthusiasm, the way his tail wagged in double time whenever she spoke, and the way his floppy ears perked up when he sensed something unusual. He wasn't just her best friend, he was her courage, her partner in crime, and her constant source of joy. That afternoon, the sun painted long golden streaks across the rolling fields as Emma and Max played by the edge of the woods. She threw a stick, and Max darted after it, his legs a blur of determination. "Good boy, Max." Emma cheered, laughing as he returned with the stick held high, his eyes gleaming with pride. It was their routine, a perfect rhythm of energy and ease. But that day, something changed. As Max darted after another stick, he froze mid-step, his ears twitching. Emma noticed immediately. "What is it, boy?" she called out, her cheerful tone shifting to curiosity. Max sniffed the air, his body tensing as though he had caught a scent that wasn't familiar. Emma watched as her usually playful dog became serious, his gaze fixed on something deeper in the woods. Emma brushed the dirt off her jeans, curiosity flickering in her chest. "All right, Max," she said with a grin. "Let's see what's got you so worked up this time." Max barked once, wagging his tail, then bounded toward the shadows of the trees. Emma jogged after him, the laughter from earlier giving way to a sense of anticipation she couldn't quite explain. For as long as she could remember, Emma had been drawn to the woods behind her home. To most people, it was just a cluster of trees, with a few worn trails. But to Emma, it was an endless world of possibilities. The rustling leaves whispered secrets she longed to uncover, and the towering trees felt like old friends watching over her adventures. Every twist and turn in those trails held a memory. the spot where she'd built her first fort out of branches with her dad. The small clearing where she and Max had once found a family of foxes darting between the bushes. And her favorite place of all, a small hill where the sunlight filtered through the canopy, creating a golden glow she loved to sit under and daydream. Emma didn't just walk through the woods, she explored them with the determination of an adventurer charting unknown territories. She would wander for hours, picking up interesting stones, marveling at the patterns of moss growing on fallen logs, or simply imagining the stories the forest might tell if it could speak. Her parents often joked that Emma would come back from her walks covered in so much dirt, it was like she'd been wrestling the earth itself. But the woods weren't just about adventure, they were her sanctuary. On days when school felt overwhelming or her little brother wouldn't stop pestering her, Emma would grab Max's leash and disappear into the trees. The stillness and the fresh scent of pine soothed her, in a way nothing else could. She loved the sense of freedom she felt out there, like she could be anyone, go anywhere, and do anything. Max was her perfect partner for these excursions. His nose seemed to know every inch of the forest, and he always found the most fascinating paths, as if leading her to new discoveries on purpose. Together, they'd weave between trees and leap over roots, their laughter and barking blending into the symphony of the forest. That day felt no different at first. With the sun warm on her face and Max happily trotting ahead, Emma let herself get lost in the familiar comfort of their favorite trails. But as they ventured deeper, Emma realized Max wasn't leading her down the usual paths. He stopped, sniffed the air, and barked a sharp, focused sound that cut through the peaceful quiet. "Come on, Max," Emma said, brushing a stray curl from her face. "What did you find this time?" Her voice was light, but there was a spark in her eyes. She loved these moments when Max's instincts took over and the adventure became more than she'd planned. Max barked again, his tail wagging as he bounded off the trail into the thicker trees. Emma hesitated only for a moment before following, her heart beating a little faster, not with fear, but with the thrill of something new. The woods had always been her playground, her refuge, her place of peace. But today they were something more, a gateway to a story she never expected. The sun hung low in the afternoon sky, painting the fields in shades of gold and green. A soft breeze rustled the tall grass, carrying with it the scents of wildflowers and pine from the woods. Emma kicked at a small rock on the dirt trail as Max trotted ahead, his nose pressed to the ground, sniffing at every tuft of grass and root he passed. "Don't go too far, Max," she called playfully, her voice carrying a light-heartedness that matched the summer air. Max glanced back for a moment, his ears twitching, before continuing his determined pace. Emma smiled, rolling her eyes at his stubborn curiosity. It was typical Max, always leading the way, as if he had somewhere important to be. They had started their usual walk through the woods behind the farmhouse, but something about today felt different. The sun seemed warmer, the air richer, and the woods more inviting. Emma felt a pull to keep going, to venture past the familiar trails where she and Max usually roam. It wasn't a conscious decision, her feet simply kept moving, one step further, then another, into parts of the forest she had never explored. The trees here grew taller, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that let only patches of sunlight through. The familiar crunch of the dirt path faded as the trail narrowed and twisted, replaced by the soft rustle of leaves underfoot. Emma paused to look around, her gaze following the dappled light as it danced across the trunks. She hadn't planned to come this far, but the forest seemed to beckon her deeper. Max barked sharply, breaking her thoughts. He stood a few yards ahead, tail wagging furiously, his body poised like he'd made some incredible discovery. "What is it, boy?" Emma asked, quickening her pace to catch up. Max didn't respond, his focus glued to something in the distance. Emma felt her curiosity grow. She hadn't been this far out before, and the forest here felt untouched, like a secret only Max had been waiting to uncover. The breeze seemed to carry a quieter hum, and even the birdsong faded as the woods grew denser around them. "All right, Max," she said, brushing a twig off her shirt. "You've led me this far, what's next?" Max barked again, a sound that was less playful and more insistent. He darted off the faint trail into the trees, leaving Emma with no choice but to follow. She ducked under low branches and carefully stepped over roots, the forest floor soft and uneven beneath her sneakers. The air cooled as they moved further, the thick canopy above filtering out most of the sunlight. "Where are you taking me, boy?" Emma asked, her voice softer now, as if speaking too loudly might disrupt the stillness around them. She wasn't scared Max was always by her side, but there was a strange sense of anticipation in the air, like they were on the verge of finding something important. Max slowed, his ears twitching as he approached a clearing ahead. Emma followed, her heart pounding just a little faster. She wasn't sure what she expected to see, but nothing could have prepared her for the sight that lay before her. An old, weathered cabin, half hidden by the overgrown vines and the shadows of the towering trees around it. Emma stopped in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. The cabin looked like it had been forgotten by time, left to the elements to reclaim. The windows were dark, their panes cracked or missing altogether, and the wooden planks of the walls were warped and splintered. Yet there was something oddly inviting about it, as if it had been waiting for someone to find it. Max barked softly, his tail wagging as he looked back at Emma, urging her forward. Emma hesitated, taking in the sight before her. She had wandered these woods for years, but she had never seen this place. How could it have been so close all along, hidden in plain sight? She took a tentative step forward, her fingers brushing against the rough bark of a nearby tree for balance. The summer air, warm and vibrant just moments ago, seemed to grow still. Emma glanced at Max, whose excitement hadn't wavered. "All right," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Emma watched as Max sniffed the air, his movements becoming sharper, more deliberate. His ears twitched in quick, nervous motions, and he let out a low growl before darting a few steps ahead. Then he stopped abruptly, his body rigid, nose to the ground, pawing at the earth as if he'd uncovered something unseen. "Max?" Emma called, her voice tinged with curiosity. Usually, his excitement meant he'd spotted a rabbit, or maybe one of the squirrels he loved chasing, but this was different. His tail wasn't wagging, and his usual playfulness had been replaced by an almost frantic energy. "What's going on, boy?" Max barked once a sharp, commanding sound and darted off the trail, plunging into the thick underbrush. Emma hesitated for a moment. They'd been this far into the woods before, but Max had never veered this sharply off course. She stepped forward carefully, her sneakers crunching on dried leaves and twigs as she pushed through the brush. "Max, slow down," she called out, quickening her pace. The dog had vanished into the shadows of the trees ahead, but she could still hear him barking in short, sharp bursts. It wasn't the usual cheerful yapping she was used to. It sounded urgent, almost like he was calling her to follow. She broke into a jog, ducking under low-hanging branches and sidestepping roots that seemed to rise up to trip her. The deeper she went, the quieter the woods became. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just the distant echo of Max's barking pulling her forward. The air felt heavier here, the light dimmer, as if the trees were closing in around her. Emma's breath quickened. "Max, come on. What's gotten into you?" she shouted, her voice louder now, though it seemed to be swallowed by the stillness around her. She paused to catch her breath, scanning the dense trees for any sign of her dog. A sudden rustling to her left made her jump, but it was only a squirrel, darting up a tree. Before she could call out again, Max barked once more, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of his nails scratching against something solid. Emma pushed through the last of the underbrush, her heart pounding, and stopped abruptly at the edge of a small clearing. There he was, Max, standing with his front paws against a wooden structure half hidden by vines and moss. His tail wagged slightly, but his stance was still alert, his head tilted as he stared at the dark, empty windows of what looked like a cabin. Emma froze, her eyes widening. The cabin seemed to rise out of the forest itself, its weathered planks blending into the shadows of the trees. The roof sagged, and one of the shutters hung loosely, swaying slightly in the breeze. Emma had wandered these woods for years, but she'd never seen anything like this. How had it stayed hidden? Max barked again, his nose pressed against the cabin's door, pawing at it impatiently. Emma stepped closer, her pulse quickening. "What is this place?" she murmured, more to herself than to Max. The cabin looked abandoned. but there was something unsettling about it, like it wasn't entirely lifeless. Max barked again, louder this time, and Emma jumped. Okay, I'm coming," she said, inching forward. Her hand hovered over the rusted doorknob, but she hesitated, glancing back at Max. "You better know what you're doing, boy," she muttered. Max let out a soft whine, his nose nudging the door as if urging her on. The cabin stood silent, waiting, as Emma's fingers finally wrapped around the doorknob. It was ice cold to the touch. With Max at her side, she gave it a gentle twist, the creak of the hinges echoing through the stillness of the forest. Emma's steps slowed as the forest thickened, the once open paths narrowing into shadows. The trees seemed alive, their gnarled branches weaving together like conspirators sharing a secret. The air here was colder, damp and heavy, clinging to her skin. She paused, one hand on her chest, trying to calm her erratic breathing. It felt like stepping into another world, one the sun had abandoned long ago. Max darted ahead, weaving through the underbrush with a single-minded focus that sent a fresh wave of uneasy through her. He'd always been an adventurous dog, but this was different. His nose skimmed the ground, his body taut with purpose, tail wagging in slow, deliberate arcs. "Max," she called, her voice sharper than she intended. The stillness of the forest swallowed the sound, as if it didn't want to carry her words. "What is it? Come back here." Max didn't stop. His ears twitched, his head lifting just enough to glance back at her briefly before resuming his frantic pursuit. He let out a bark short and sharp, echoing like a shot in the quiet woods. It wasn't playful. It wasn't curious. It was urgent. Emma hesitated, her boots crunching against the layer of leaves and twigs underfoot. Something about the way Max moved, the way he barked, made her heart flutter with a strange mix of fear and curiosity. She took a step forward, then another, the forest seeming to close in tighter around her. As she pushed through a thicket of brush, her foot caught on a root, sending her stumbling forward. She threw out her hands, catching herself against a tree, the rough bark scraping her palms. "Great," she muttered, brushing dirt from her knees. Her voice sounded small, inconsequential, in a suffocating stillness. Then she looked up and froze. There it was. The cabin stood just beyond a curtain of vines, as if the forest had decided to part its veil just for her. It wasn't just hidden, it felt concealed, cloaked in the shadows of ancient trees and draped in ivy so thick it seemed to grow as she stared. The structure leaned precariously, its walls sagging inward under the weight of time and neglect. The roof was a patchwork of rotting shingles and moss, giving it an otherworldly, organic appearance, like the forest itself was reclaiming it piece by piece. Emma blinked, her heart thudding. How had she never seen this before? She'd explored these woods 100 times, always careful to note her surroundings, yet this place had escaped her notice entirely. It was as though the cabin had been hiding, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Max stood at the base of the weathered steps, his tail wagging in that same steady rhythm. His ears perked, and his gaze locked on hers. It wasn't the usual playful look he gave when he found something interesting. It was expectant, almost knowing. The sight of him there, framed by the eerie cabin, made Emma's stomach twist. "What is this?" she whispered, taking a hesitant step closer. The cabin's hollow windows gaped at her like empty eye sockets, their shattered glass glinting faintly in the dim light. A single shutter dangled from rusted hinges, swaying in the faint breeze with a soft, rhythmic creak. The sound grated on her nerves, too regular, too deliberate, like a heartbeat. The front door loomed, warped and splintered, its surface marred by deep, jagged gouges. Emma's breath hitched as she studied the marks. They were even and raw, as though something or someone had clawed at the wood with desperate ferocity. Her mind raced, imagining talons or fingernails digging into the door in a frantic bid to get in or out. She hesitated, her instinct screaming at her to turn back, to leave this place and never return. But Max was already on the steps, his nails clicking against the wood as he sniffed at the doorframe. He turned back to her and whined softly, urging her forward. "Max," Emma's voice trailed off. Her feet moved despite her better judgment, carrying her up the groaning steps. She paused at the top, her gaze tracing the claw marks that scarred the doorframe. Up close, the air felt colder, sharper, as though the cabin exhaled a breath laced with secrets. "What are we doing here?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Max nudged her leg, his nose pressing insistently against her knee. She crouched, running her hand over his fur for reassurance, but it did little to calm the knot tightening in her chest. With a shaky exhale, Emma straightened and reached for the doorknob. It was rusted and pitted, the metal icy against her skin. She twisted gently. The door resisted at first, groaning in protest, but then it gave way with a creak that echoed into the silent forest. The sound made her wince. A faint, musty smell wafted out, damp wood, decay, and something metallic that she couldn't identify. She hesitated, peering into the dim interior. The shadows inside seemed to ripple, as if the cabin were alive and breathing. "All right," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "Let's see what you've found, Max." Stepping inside was like stepping into another time. The air was heavier here, pressing against her chest like an invisible weight. Narrow beams of sunlight pierced through cracks in the walls, illuminating floating dust motes that swirled lazily in the still air. The room was shrouded in shadow, broken only by the faint outlines of broken furniture and scattered debris. Emma's gaze swept over the interior, her unease growing with every detail. The walls were covered in carvings and scratches, some deep and jagged, others delicate and intricate. Spirals, symbols, and chaotic lines sprawled across the wood like a language she couldn't begin to understand. The sight of them made her skin prickle, her fingers tingling as though the air itself carried a charge. She stepped closer to one of the carvings, her hand hovering above it. The grooves felt purposeful, deliberate, as though whoever had made them had been trying to communicate something or summon something. The thought sent a shiver racing down her spine. "What were they trying to say?" she whispered, her voice swallowed by the oppressive quiet. She glanced down at Max, who was sniffing at the floor, seemingly unfazed. His calmness only unsettled her more. Her foot crunched against something brittle, and she flinched. Glancing down, she saw shards of a photo frame scattered across the floor. Its glass was shattered, its edges warped, but what drew her attention was the photograph beneath the debris. Emma crouched, picking it up with trembling hands. The black and white image was faded but unmistakable, a young girl and a dog. The girl's face was soft and smiling, her hair wild with curls, but it was the dog that made Emma's heart stutter. Its markings were identical to Max's. "That's impossible," she murmured, turning the photograph over. The back was blank. She looked up at Max, who stood near a small door at the far end of the room, pawing at the floor with growing urgency. "What is it now?" she asked, her voice wavering. She rose, clutching the photograph tightly, and crossed the creaking floorboards. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the cabin itself were trying to hold her back. Max scratched at the base of the door, his movements frantic. Emma hesitated, her gaze darting back to the strange carvings that covered the walls. They seemed to shift in the corner of her vision, their patterns writhing like living things. The air grew colder, the metallic tang sharper, filling her nose and clinging to the back of her throat. "Okay," she said, her voice firm despite the fear constricting her chest. "Just a quick look, and then we're out of here. I promise." Kneeling beside Max, Emma brushed away the debris covering the trapdoor. The wood beneath was darker, stained with something that made her stomach churn. She ran her fingers along the edges, hesitating as her pulse thundered in her ears. "Why are we doing this?" she whispered, more to herself than to Max. He barked sharply, the sound startling in the oppressive silence. His tail wagged furiously, his nose pressing against the trapdoor as though urging her on. Emma swallowed hard, her hand trembling as she gripped the edge of the trapdoor. The wood was cold and damp under her fingertips, and for a moment she thought she felt it pulse, as though the cabin itself had a heartbeat. Taking a deep breath, she pulled. The trapdoor groaned open, revealing a darkness so complete it seemed to swallow the light. A faint, acrid smell wafted up, sharp and sour, making her gag. She leaned back, clutching Max's leash tightly as she stared into the void below. "Max," she whispered, her voice shaking. "What have you found?" Her flashlight trembled as she clicked it on, the beam cutting through the thick darkness. The light revealed a narrow staircase descending into the earth, its steps worn and splintered. Strange symbols were etched into the walls, glowing faintly as the light passed over them. Emma's breath quickened as the beam landed on something at the bottom of the stairs, something glinting faintly in the light. Her grip on Max's leash tightened, and for the first time, her faithful companion whined, low and uncertain. "Okay," she said, her voice barely audible. "Just a quick look." As she descended, each step felt like crossing a threshold she could never return from. The walk back from the cabin felt heavier than usual. The once crisp autumn air seemed denser, every breath carrying a weight Emma couldn't shake. The wooden box was tucked tightly under her arm, its edges digging into her ribs with each step, and her backpack sagged with the added burden of the diary page, rusty key, and faded map. Max walked ahead of her, his usual boundless energy subdued. His head hung low, his ears occasionally flicking back to check on her, as if he too felt the significance of what they'd found. Emma kept glancing over her shoulder. The cabin was long out of sight, hidden once more by the dense thicket of trees, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The forest, silent as ever, pressed in around her. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf sent her pulse racing. She tightened her grip on the box, her fingers brushing over its intricate carvings, and whispered to herself, "Almost home. Just keep moving." By the time they emerged from the woods, the sky had shifted to hues of orange and pink, the sun dipping low on the horizon. The sight of her house, its familiar sagging roof and creaking porch, brought a fleeting sense of relief. Max bounded up the steps ahead of her, but instead of waiting at the door like he usually did, he turned and sat at her feet, his gaze fixed on the wooden box in her hands. "What do you know, boy?" Emma muttered, crouching to scratch behind his ears. His tail wagged faintly, but his eyes never left the box. The porch creaked beneath her as she stood. Her grandmother was there, as always, nestled in her favorite wicker chair. The rhythmic click of knitting needles filled the air, steady and comforting. Her grandmother looked up, her sharp eyes narrowing the moment she saw Emma's troubled expression. "You're late," her grandmother said, her voice calm but tinged with curiosity. "Out exploring again, I see." Emma hesitated at the threshold, the box feeling heavier in her arms. She nodded but didn't speak. Instead, she unzipped her backpack, pulled out the photograph, and held it out. The old paper trembled in her hand as she crossed the porch to her grandmother. The older woman reached for it, her movements slow and deliberate. But the moment her fingers touched the photograph, her knitting needles slipped from her lap, clattering against the wooden floorboards. Her face drained of color, her hands shaking as she brought the photo closer to her eyes. Where did you get this?" Her voice, usually so steady, was low and trembling. "In the woods," Emma replied softly, sitting beside her on the porch steps. "Max found an old cabin back there. It was full of strange things, photos, carvings, even this." She placed the wooden box on the small table between them, its intricate carvings catching the fading sunlight. Her grandmother didn't even glance at the box. Her gaze was locked on the photograph, her thumb brushing over the image of the girl and the dog. This is Lily," she whispered. "My sister, your great-aunt Lily." Emma blinked in disbelief. "Your sister? You never told me you had a sister." Her grandmother let out a shaky breath, her thumb pausing over the faded image. "She disappeared long before you were born," she said softly. "We never knew what happened to her. She was just gone." "Gone where?" Emma pressed, leaning forward. She could see the pain etched into her grandmother's face, but the question burned too brightly to stay unspoken. Her grandmother shook her head, her expression a mix of sorrow and regret. "She loved those woods, just like you. One summer 1974, it was all she talked about. She said she'd found something out there, something incredible. She wouldn't tell anyone what it was, but she swore it would change everything." Emma reached into her backpack and pulled out the diary page. She smoothed it carefully and placed it on the table next to the box. "The lost summer of 74, she murmured, reading the faded words aloud. "That's what it says here. Do you think that's what she was talking about?" Her grandmother's fingers hovered over the page, then slowly traced the delicate writing. She wrote that, she said, her voice almost inaudible. She must have. Lily was always scribbling things down, keeping secrets. We didn't believe her back then. We thought it was just another one of her wild ideas. Why didn't she tell you what she found? Emma asked, her voice tinged with frustration. The photograph, the diary page, the carvings in the cabin, they all felt like puzzle pieces, tantalizingly close to forming a picture, but still incomplete. She said it wasn't safe. Her grandmother replied, her voice barely above a whisper. She said she needed to protect it. That it was more important than anything else. I thought she was being dramatic. But then one day she went into the woods and never came back. Emma's gaze shifted to the wooden box, its star-shaped keyhole gleaming faintly in the fading light. Do you think this has something to do with it? Her grandmother finally looked at the box, her brow furrowing. She reached out, her fingers brushing over the carvings. I've never seen this before, she said cautiously. But if it was in that cabin, then yes, I'm sure it's connected. Emma hesitated. There's something else, she said, pulling the map and rusty key from her backpack. She unfolded the map carefully, laying it flat on the table. This was hidden in the floorboards. It shows the woods and there's a spot marked with Lily's initials --L.P. Her grandmother leaned in, her hands trembling as she examined the map. This is where the cabin is, she said, pointing to the circled area. But these X, they weren't there before. What could they mean? I don't know, Emma said, sitting back. But there were carvings on the walls in the cabin, 2 initials, symbols. It looked like someone was trying to leave clues. Her grandmother's face was pale, her expression distant. We searched those woods for months after she disappeared. My parents, the neighbors, even the police. No one found a single trace of her. But if you found these, she trailed off, her eyes returning to the photograph. Maybe she was leaving a trail. Maybe she wanted someone to find this. Emma looked down at Max, who sat quietly at her feet, his eyes half closed but still alert. There's one more thing, she said carefully. The dog in the pictures, it looks just like Max. Her grandmother's eyes widened, darting to Max and then back to the photograph. It does, she whispered. But that's not possible. Lily's dog disappeared with her. He would have been long gone by now. Emma reached down, scratching Max behind the ears. His fur was warm under her hand, grounding her as her mind raced. I don't understand it either, she said softly. But Max led me to the cabin. It's like he knew it was there. Her grandmother sat back in her chair, her expression unreadable. For a long moment she didn't speak, her fingers still gripping the photograph. Finally, she said, whatever this is, Emma, you need to be careful. Emma nodded, her gaze shifting between the map, the box, and the diary page. Each piece seemed to call to her, urging her to look deeper. I need to go back, she said finally. Her grandmother didn't protest. She simply placed a hand over Emma's and said, if you're going to keep looking, promise me you'll be careful. And don't go alone. Take Max, and come straight back if something feels wrong. I promise, Emma said, though the words felt hollow. Her resolve had already hardened. Whatever Lily had found, it was still out there, waiting to be uncovered. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world into shadow, Emma sat on the porch, the box in her lap and Max's warm body pressed against her leg. The carvings on the box seemed to glow faintly in the twilight, their intricate patterns swirling like tiny constellations. Emma's grandmother stood, her voice heavy with finality. Some secrets should stay buried, Emma. Just remember that. Emma didn't reply. Her gaze was fixed on the map, her thoughts swirling with questions that demanded answers. Whatever lay ahead, she knew she couldn't turn back now. The next morning, the forest seemed different, as though it had sensed their intentions. The dense canopy of trees barely allowed the rising sun to filter through, casting the woods in muted shades of grey and green. The chill in the air was sharper, nipping at Emma's skin as she adjusted the straps of her backpack. It felt heavier than usual, the weight of the wooden box, the rusty key, and the map pressing against her shoulders. Emma glanced at her grandmother walking beside her. Her grandmother's breaths were steady but deliberate, her thin frame leaning slightly on a walking stick she'd brought for balance. Neither had spoken much since leaving the house. The tension between them was palpable, a mix of anticipation and unease. Max padded ahead, his movements deliberate and his tail low, as though even he understood the gravity of their journey. The deeper they went into the forest, the quieter it became. The rustling leaves and distant chirps of birds gave way to an oppressive stillness, broken only by the occasional crack of a twig beneath their feet. Emma's eyes flicked toward every shadow, every twist in the trail, half expecting something or someone to step out. When they finally reached the clearing, Emma's breath caught in her throat. The cabin stood exactly as they had left it the day before, yet it seemed different. The morning light gave the weathered wood a sickly pallor, the ivy crawling up its sides appearing darker, almost black. The hollow windows stared back at them like vacant eyes, and the air around the structure was unnaturally still. Emma hesitated at the threshold, her heart pounding as she glanced back at her grandmother. Her grandmother offered a small nod of reassurance, but the tightness in her jaw betrayed her unease. "I'll be right here," she said softly, her voice steadier than Emma expected. Emma pushed open the creaking door, and the cabin greeted them with a familiar, suffocating silence. Dust hung in the air, swirling in the faint beams of light that pierced through cracks in the walls. The wooden floor groaned under their weight as they stepped inside. Max moved to the corner, his usual spot, where he sat with his head tilted, watching Emma expectantly. She knelt down where she had found the wooden box the day before. Her fingers brushed over the rough wood of the floor as she pulled the box from her backpack. The carvings on its surface seemed to glimmer faintly, as though they had absorbed the morning light. Emma pulled the rusty key from her pocket, its cool metal sending a shiver through her fingers as she inserted it into the star-shaped lock. The key turned smoothly, clicking softly as the lock released. For a moment, Emma simply stared at the box, her breath shallow and her mind racing. What would she find inside? Answers? More questions? She glanced back at her grandmother, who stood silently by the door, her eyes fixed on the box. Taking a deep breath, Emma lifted the lid. The interior was lined with faded velvet, its edges worn and fraying. Inside was a collection of objects that seemed both ordinary and profoundly significant. The first item she lifted out was a bundle of letters, tied together with twine. The paper was yellowed with age, and though the ink had faded, fragments of Lily's handwriting were still legible in places. Emma's fingers brushed over the bundle as though it might crumble at her touch. Beneath the letters were small trinkets, a delicate locket with a tarnished chain, a ribbon that had once been a vibrant blue but had faded to an indistinct grey, and a smooth stone that fit perfectly in Emma's palm. The stone was warm, almost unnaturally so, its surface etched with faint markings she couldn't decipher. But it was the journal at the bottom of the box that caught her attention. Its leather cover was cracked with age, and the edges of its pages were brittle and uneven. Emma picked it up carefully, her hands trembling as she opened it to the first page. The writing was neat but hurried, as though the author had been racing to capture her thoughts. She read the first entry aloud, her voice quiet but steady. June 12, 1974. I've found it. The treasure isn't gold or jewels, it's something far more precious. I can't believe it's real. Her grandmother took a step closer, peering over her shoulder. The entries that followed painted a vivid picture of Lily's days in the woods. Emma read aloud, her voice growing steadier with each word, as Lily described her discovery, a grove hidden deep within the forest, a place she called the heart of the forest. It's not just a place, one entry read. It's alive. I can feel it watching me, listening to me. It's not like anything else I've ever known. It's beautiful, but it's also ancient. It feels like it doesn't belong in this world anymore. Emma's grandmother's breath hitched at the words. She always talked about the woods like they were magical, she said, her voice trembling. We thought it was just her imagination. But she was serious, wasn't she? Emma nodded, flipping through more pages. Lily's fascination with the grove was clear, but so was her growing fear. She wrote about strangers in the woods, people she didn't recognize who seemed to be searching for something. They know something is here, Lily had written. I can feel them getting closer. The grove is in danger. I promised the spirit I would protect it, but I don't know how much longer I can keep it safe." "The spirit?" Emma's grandmother whispered, leaning closer. Her hand rested lightly on Emma's shoulder as they read the next passage together. "It's not human, but it's not an animal either," Lily had written. "It doesn't speak, but it communicates. I don't know how to explain it. I know it wants me to protect the grove, to keep it safe, but I don't know if I can." Emma turned to the final entry, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the brittle pages. The last words sent a chill down her spine. "If someone finds this, it means I couldn't finish what I started. I'm sorry. Please, protect the grove. Don't let it die." Tucked between the final pages was an envelope, sealed and marked with the words for the finder. Emma hesitated, glancing at her grandmother, who nodded for her to continue. She carefully opened the envelope, revealing a folded piece of paper and a smaller envelope inside. Her grandmother took a step closer, peering over her shoulder. The entries that followed painted a vivid picture of Lily's days in the woods. Emma read aloud, her voice growing steadier with each word, as Lily described her discovery, a grove hidden deep within the forest, a place she called the heart of the forest. "It's not just a place," one entry read. "It's alive. I can feel it watching me, listening to me. It's not like anything else I've ever known. It's beautiful, but it's also ancient. It feels like it doesn't belong in this world anymore." Emma's grandmother's breath hitched at the words. "She always talked about the woods like they were magical," she said, her voice trembling. "We thought it was just her imagination. But she was serious, wasn't she?" Emma nodded, flipping through more pages. Lily's fascination with the grove was clear, but so was her growing fear. She wrote about strangers in the woods, people she didn't recognize who seemed to be searching for something. "They know something is here," Lily had written. "I can feel them getting closer. The grove is in danger. I promised the spirit I would protect it, but I don't know how much longer I can keep it safe." "The spirit?" Emma's grandmother whispered, leaning closer. Her hand rested lightly on Emma's shoulder as they read the next passage together. "It's not human, but it's not an animal either," Lily had written. "It doesn't speak, but it communicates. I don't know how to explain it. I know it wants me to protect the grove, to keep it safe, but I don't know if I can." Emma turned to the final entry, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the brittle pages. The last words sent a chill down her spine. "If someone finds this, it means I couldn't finish what I started. I'm sorry. Please, protect the grove. Don't let it die." Tucked between the final pages was an envelope, sealed and marked with the words for the finder. Emma hesitated, glancing at her grandmother, who nodded for her to continue. She carefully opened the envelope, revealing a folded piece of paper and a smaller envelope inside. The first piece of paper was a deed to their family home, dated years before Emma's grandmother had ever inherited it. Lily's name was listed as the owner. Emma's grandmother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The smaller envelope contained a map and a handwritten note. The map was far more detailed than the one Emma had found in the cabin floorboards, with intricate markings that indicated specific locations deep within the forest. The note read, "The grove is the heart. Protect it, and everything else will thrive. Follow the map. Use the forest's gifts. Heal what has been broken." Tears streamed down her grandmother's face as she read the words. "She was trying to save something," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Something bigger than any of us understood." Emma stared at the map, her resolve hardening. "She wanted us to finish what she started," she said quietly. "We have to protect the grove. For her. For the forest." Her grandmother wiped her eyes, her expression a mixture of grief and determination. "We will," she said firmly. "We owe her that much." Max let out a soft bark, breaking the heavy silence. Emma glanced at him, her heart pounding, as she folded the map and slipped it into her backpack. The weight of Lily's legacy settled over her like a heavy cloak, but beneath it was a growing sense of purpose. As they stepped out of the cabin, the forest seemed to stir, the leaves rustling gently in the breeze. Emma glanced back one last time at the weathered structure, her hand brushing against the warm stone in her pocket. Lily's story wasn't over. And now, it was up to Emma to write the next chapter. The following day, Emma and her grandmother ventured back into the woods, the early morning air cool and still as though the forest was holding its breath. Sunlight dappled the ground in fleeting patches, casting long shadows across the faint path before them. The deeper they went, the quieter the woods became, the chirping of birds and rustling of leaves fading into an almost reverent silence. Emma clutched the map tightly, her fingers brushing against its creased edges. She paused now and then to match the landmarks around them to the markings on the map. Her steps were purposeful, but the weight of uncertainty pressed on her chest. Her grandmother walked beside her, silent but resolute, her hand occasionally brushing against the trunks of ancient trees, as though seeking reassurance. Max led the way, his movements precise and deliberate, his nose occasionally lifting to sniff the air. He walked as though he knew exactly where they were headed, his tail low and steady. The path grew fainter with each step, hidden beneath decades of moss and fallen leaves. Roots twisted like ancient veins, their gnarled forms carving patterns into the earth. Some of the trees bore scars long, deep grooves that seemed to whisper stories of storms and seasons past. As Emma walked, she felt an unexpected sense of connection to the forest, as though the ground beneath her feet recognized her. It was an odd, comforting feeling, as if the woods were welcoming her. After what felt like hours, the forest opened into a clearing. Emma froze at the edge, her breath catching in her chest. Sunlight streamed through a break in the canopy, illuminating the grove ahead. Massive, ancient trees formed a protective circle around a shimmering spring, their towering forms casting long, twisting shadows. The water sparkled like liquid glass, its surface rippling faintly, even though there was no wind. The air was alive with a quiet energy, and the light seemed to dance across the spring, creating fleeting patterns that shifted and dissolved like whispers in the air. Emma stepped into the clearing cautiously, her grandmother following close behind. The soft moss underfoot muffled their movements, making the grove feel even more sacred. Around the edges of the spring were carvings etched into smooth stones and the trunks of the surrounding trees. The symbols were faintly familiar, similar to those they had seen in the cabin, but here they seemed to pulse faintly, as if carrying the heartbeat of the forest itself. Emma knelt by the edge of the spring, her reflection rippling as she reached out to touch the water. It was cooler than she expected, almost unnaturally so, and as she pulled her hand back, she felt a faint tingling, a warmth that spread through her fingertips and lingered in her palm. "This is it," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "This is what Lily found." Her grandmother moved to stand behind her, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "She wasn't lying," she said softly. "All those years we thought it was just her imagination. But she was trying to protect this. She knew how important it was." Emma looked at her grandmother, then at Max, who sat silently by the spring, his head tilted slightly, his ears twitching, as though listening to something only he could hear. The carvings around them seemed to glow faintly, their patterns shifting ever so slightly in the dappled light. Emma's breath hitched as a wave of understanding washed over her. "She called it the heart of the forest," she said, her voice steady despite the tightness in her throat, "and she said it needed to be protected." Her grandmother nodded, her voice thick with emotion. "We owe her that much," she said. "She gave everything to keep this safe. It's up to us now to make sure her sacrifice wasn't in vain." Emma's gaze lingered on the carvings. The symbols seemed to speak to her, though she couldn't quite understand their meaning. Max barked softly, a low, deliberate sound that echoed faintly through the grove. He stood suddenly, moving to a tree near the edge of the clearing. Emma followed his gaze and saw a small carving, a faint outline of a handprint, delicate but unmistakable. Without thinking, she placed her own hand over it. A soft warmth spread through her palm, and for a fleeting moment, she felt something. A presence. Watching. Listening. The sensation was overwhelming yet comforting, like an embrace from something ancient and benevolent. In the days that followed, Emma and her grandmother began to piece together a plan. They knew it wasn't enough to simply find the spring, it had to be protected, just as Lily had intended. Emma took Lily's journal, the map, and the handwritten note, and began reaching out to people in the community. At first there was skepticism. Some dismissed her story as fanciful, but others were drawn in by her determination and the tangible evidence she presented. Slowly, the community began to rally behind her. Families who had lived in the area for generations offered their support, donating time and resources to help preserve the grove. Conservationists and forestry experts joined the effort, advising on how to safeguard the ancient trees and delicate ecosystem around the spring. Trails were cleared, overgrown plants were carefully managed, and signs were erected to educate visitors about the grove's history and importance. Emma worked tirelessly, her passion igniting a movement that grew larger than she ever imagined. Her grandmother, though weary from the journey, found renewed purpose in sharing Lily's story with anyone who would listen. Together they ensured that the grove would remain a sanctuary for generations to come, a living testament to Lily's courage and the forest's enduring magic. Months later, as autumn painted the forest in hues of gold and crimson, Emma returned to the cabin. It had been carefully restored, its walls repaired and its carvings preserved. Inside, the space had been transformed into a small memorial filled with artifacts from Lily's life. Her journal and photographs sat on display, alongside the wooden box and the map that had led Emma to the grove. A plaque near the door read, "In memory of Lily Parker, Protector of the Grove, 1958 to 1974. Emma stood at the doorway, Max by her side. The cabin no longer felt heavy with abandonment, it felt alive, a beacon of the past and a promise for the future. She knelt beside Max, scratching behind his ears. "We did it," she whispered. "We kept her promise." Max barked softly, his tail wagging as he stepped into the cabin. Emma followed, letting the warmth of the restored space wash over her. She placed her hand on the table, where the wooden box had once rested, her fingers brushing the smooth surface. A faint smile tugged at her lips as she thought of Lily, her heart swelling with gratitude and determination. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the clearing, Emma and Max stepped back outside. She stood for a moment, gazing out at the woods that stretched endlessly before her. They were no longer just a place of adventure, they were a legacy, a responsibility. Max barked again, his ears perking as he turned toward the trees. Emma frowned, following his gaze. At first she saw nothing but shadows shifting in the fading light. But then, just at the edge of her vision, there was a flicker, a glimmer of something bright and fleeting, like a firefly or a trick of the light. She smiled, her chest tightening with a mix of wonder and anticipation. "What is it, Max?" she asked softly. But Max didn't move. He stayed rooted in place, his eyes fixed on the forest, his tail wagging slowly. The woods around them seemed to whisper, the sound almost too faint to hear. Emma turned toward the cabin one last time before stepping forward into the clearing, her mind racing with questions, her heart steady with resolve. The forest wasn't finished with her yet. Sometimes, the past reveals itself in the most unexpected ways, and what we find can redefine our present and future. Emma's discovery of the hidden grove and her great-aunt Lily's forgotten legacy not only brought long-sought closure to her family, but also sparked a movement that united an entire community. Together they honored the forest, its guardian spirit, and the sacrifices that kept it alive for generations to come. What stories are hidden in the places you call home? What mysteries are waiting to be uncovered in your own backyard? Share your thoughts below, we'd love to hear them. If this story moved you, please give it a thumbs up and share it with someone who loves a good mystery. Don't forget to subscribe and join us next time for more incredible tales that touch the heart and ignite the imagination. Your support helps us keep bringing these unforgettable stories to life.